Good morning, everybody. Okay, so I go to a Black Baptist church, and when the pastor tells us on Sunday morning a good old happy good morning, he says, turn to your neighbor and say good morning. So turn to your neighbor and say good morning. Thank you for indulging me. I am really grateful to be here. This has been an honor. We met at a conference, and I was immediately asked to be a keynote after providing some remarks. And it's really nice to be here for two reasons. The first one being I'm home because I travel a lot. So to do a keynote within my own backyard is actually quite refreshing. And two, because I really believe in the power of libraries. In the work that I've done for the last 20 years, it's really been around building community infrastructure to close the digital divide. And so this presents an extravagant opportunity to have this discussion with all of you in light of the research that I'm doing at Brookings and the forthcoming book that I have. So I thank you for having me. I'm going to jump right into this conversation. It's early morning. I'm the first speaker, and I have the duty of waking you up. And so one of the things that I want to start this conversation with is a quick poll. And if you all would indulge me, all I'm asking is for you to raise your hand. I'm not asking you to get up. But if you can, it would be really great and fun to indulge me in this quick, unscientific poll. Raise your hand if you have a computer at home. Raise your hand if you have a cell phone or smartphone device on your person. Raise your hand if you have another internet-enabled tablet or other type of device. Now raise your hand if you regularly go to the internet to access an app. A ride-sharing app like Uber or Lyft, Airbnb, an e-commerce site like Amazon. Now raise your hand if you actually go to the internet to access a dating site. I had to make sure everybody was awake. I actually ask that question every time I do a speech, and it's funny because the reaction is, should I really raise my hand? And she told me she's talking about church, you know? I don't know about her. So I ask that question a lot to groups because when we think about our seamless activity and online engagement, it's pretty easy for all of us in this room. We have the devices that actually go online. We know what resources actually exist to be able to benefit from the internet and all of its resources. We essentially have the tools to be digitally proficient and engaged. But that's us. If we took that conversation into some of the areas in this country that are represented by the Deep South, 2.5 hours outside of DC, in fact, are rural areas. If I went to parts of Washington, DC that are just across the river in a place called Anacostia, we'll actually see less hands raised on certain items and perhaps some confusion that all of this stuff actually exists. And this is the work that I do. At Brookings, I'm really interested as a person who has been doing this work for about 20 years on how digital technology has transformed the way that we live, learn, earn, and communicate. I have a 12 and 16-year-old, and I often say to them, life was different when I grew up. I mean, we went outside, played dodgeball, you know. It's the worst thing when you're at a cookout and you try to do duck, duck, goose with your kids, and they're looking at you like, huh? It's a new generation. But our engagement was different, but those extracurricular activities that we did back then, they didn't determine where we got a job. They didn't determine how we saved money. They didn't determine what goods and services came to our home. They were less determinant of our life chances and our quality of life. And that's the conversation we're going to have today, or the conversation I'm going to bring to you. What does this digital divide look like? And what's the role of institutions like libraries in helping to close it? Hopefully, at the end of this, I will evangelize in such a manner that you will go back to your cities, your communities, and you will see that you play a role. If my job is successful, you will be excited about wanting to close this divide, much like I am every day. So, let me give you some stats of what access looks like in America. According to the Pew Research Center, and I understand my dear friend will be here tomorrow, Lee Rainey. That's why I don't have any slides, because he's going to have tons of them, actually. I know him already. 13% of Americans are non-adopters in this country. And what does that mean? They cannot afford to go online, they live in communities where broadband is not available, or they simply do not see the relevance for being connected. Yes, there are people today that do not see the relevance of being connected. And they live here in the US. These individuals are disproportionately people of color, less literate, rural residents, older Americans, less able, and foreign-born. And they are now starting to align with, and this is a lot of the work that I do, segments of our society that experience the double and triple jeopardies of being unemployed and underemployed. They live in communities affected by what my dear friend FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel calls, they're affected by the homework gap, where young people do not have access to digital resources to finish their homework and do other assignments. They live in the absence of technology that keeps them isolated, limited, without imagination about the possibilities of what this disruption has done to our society. No joke. I was recently in Garrett County, Maryland, which is about 2.5 hours away from DC, sort of the western part of Maryland. And I asked somebody about how can I get an Uber driver? You know, my big city self. And she said, honey, there are no Uber drivers here. What are they gonna do, drive 25 miles to the next town? They barely have cars. They can't afford them. To me, that was an aha moment that we are living in a place where there are digital deserts that exist. And there's a cost to digital inclusion. Going back to my poll, for those of you who have called an Uber for convenience, do you find yourself calling an Uber sometimes because you just don't have cash on you? You know your credit card is sort of attached to your Uber account? It's just convenient, and if you've ever been in a cab lately, it's cheaper to actually take an Uber. Imagine the portrait of the 13% of people who are not online, that are not only digitally disconnected, but they're underbanked. They may not have a smartphone. They may not have a credit or any kind of financial collateral to actually underwrite that ride. And place yourself in a situation of a single mother who has to get to a primary care physician, and the only way to get there is through 2 bus routes, which now cost her time or an expensive taxi ride. I was talking to a woman yesterday who had to get her children from Lanham, Maryland to the University of Maryland to a STEM program, single mother. She was willing to pay $60 in a cab to ensure that her mother could actually transport her kids to this program, simply because she wanted to do the right thing. And in my mind, I kept thinking, girl, you don't have Uber? What about Lyft? What about that pass on Uber? Again, that is our digital native right that we feel we have that does not translate to all of America. And that's a problem. That is a problem. That is a problem of the 21st century. How do we take the very technology that was designed to solve social problems and apply that to people and conditions that it's actually furthering those disparities? I don't know if you heard what I said, but we've got a problem on our hands, folks, that we've actually got to solve. And so when you live on the wrong side of the digital divide, you lose your right to choices. You still have human and civil liberty, but you lose your right to save money, time, spend time on the things that matter in your life that actually engage you productively. It matters to an elderly parent who can no longer drive. My mother just she fell. And I'm writing an article for a paper called Aging Today. And this herniated disc has stopped her from driving and moving around. And I'm thinking, dog, if there was an autonomous vehicle, they could pick her up because my sisters and I sure can't get there in time to help her with all of the things that she needs to do. In this disrupted economy, there's a cost to this exclusion, and it costs more to be disconnected. And that's different from most of us that have heard the concept of digital divide. Raise your hand if you've heard the digital divide. Years ago, and I've been in this space for a really long time, the digital divide was more binary. Who has access, who doesn't, who has a device, who doesn't, who lives in a community where there's a library, who doesn't, does this tech center have a computer lab, which one doesn't? We are in so much more of a sophisticated world where our lives are interrelated and intercorrelated with all of these segments. There are things that we can't do as individuals. I don't know about you. When I lose my phone or the battery goes dead, I don't know what to do. I start panicking because I immediately start to think, oh Lord, I can't check my email. How are people gonna communicate with me? What am I gonna do to make sure I look at that, book that meeting? And again, that is my own aggrandizement, I would just suggest, around what technology has done for me as a middle-class woman. Put yourself on the shoes of others across in Anacostia, in rural America, and you will understand that digital access is not ubiquitous the way that we think it is. And I'm going someplace with this because I think those of you that are sitting here today, you play a role in closing that digital divide. But let me also not forget about one other thing that's actually affecting technology: artificial intelligence and machine learning. They say that computers are going to be smarter than us. Now, I got to tell you, sometimes that's probably the case because I often lose my keys. And there's got to be some kind of artificial intelligence application to remind me where my keys are. But in the end, in the fueling of that economy, I'm here to sort of tell you something. We are the product of these new innovations. Our information is what's fueling the next wave of technology. How many of you are on Facebook? Just another show of hands. And how many of you like to post your photos, talk about what you ate last night, what trip you went on, like your grandkids' pictures? Did you know that while you're doing that, all that information is collected and stored and shared and mined and repurposed to develop bigger and better applications? Did you know that your data is the fuel of what is actually moving technology? Did you know that every time that you ping this and it pings your location, it's actually fueling the next level of an app? Now, go back with me to those areas where people have less connectivity and think about what we don't know about them, what services they're not getting, and even though they may not be online, their data passively used is saying something about them. In DC, believe it or not, this small non-state, for all intents and purposes, you cannot get Uber Eats, for example, across the river. And why is that? Because there are not enough people who are banked with the resources who have the ability to have that convenience. Folks, to me, that's a digital divide. That's a digital divide. There's a senior sitting over in Anacostia somewhere who's not eating because they can't drive, or their sibling or child can't take off of work. We can't call and send food to them or groceries or medication simply because their data indicates that they live, again, in a desert where they're on the wrong side of the digital divide. There are people, and this is my last point, and then like I said, I'm building to your role, that know very little about the political economy because most of our conversations are done online. That 13% of Americans, you think they heard about the Mueller report when it first came out? Do you think they have a chance to know, in the case of voting, that their poll locations have changed because the announcement went on Twitter? Are they able, because of the lack of technology access, to get into the conversations locally that are around changing the state and nature of community and society? It used to be, and I'm going to date myself, when I was growing up, we had this thing called, well, before I grew up, because I see some of y'all know what I'm talking about, there was this thing called WAN, the LAN systems, the mainframes. I tell my kids I remember those, they go, huh? It's like sharing with them a cassette tape, and they just look at you like, what are you talking about? You had something with music like this? But many of you may remember AOL. And how many people remember the sound that went behind the AOL connection? I'm not gonna do show and tell, but it might be actually kind of funny because the person next to you will be like, what are you talking about? What was the sound of that modem? Fast forward to today, an internet that was much more static has become much more transactional. We don't hear that sound. In fact, when I sit on the metro, I'm amazed. People don't even have cords anymore. They're wearing those AirPods. I sound like my grandmother sometimes, right? I'm like, where's the sound coming from, right? But when you think about, again, this evolution of technology, what does that say about those that are not participating? So I'm doing this book, and I'm going across the country as part of a digital divide tour. Been to Stanton, Virginia, Garrett County, Maryland, Lincoln, Nebraska, Hartford, Connecticut, Cleveland, Ohio, and I basically show up. I'm a little dressed down, and I say to people, hi, what's your internet access like in America? And some people kind of look at me a little crazy. I'm a sociologist by trade, and we're all about participant observation and jumping out and becoming part of the community. But when I start to engage them in a conversation, and this goes back to my point and then the role that libraries play, they start to tell me stories of the declining nature of small farms and the inability to not have internet access and how that stifles their ordering of different products and services. They're the only mechanic in town who services everybody's car. Anybody from rural America know what I'm talking about? But yet, everything has moved from the booklet online. So getting parts and services is time consuming because you gotta have every manual, when today, with internet access, you can go online and put in the vehicle model and number. In Hartford, Connecticut, true story, I found 6 African-American girls that get up every morning and walk to McDonald's to finish their homework, simply because they cannot get internet access at home because it's not affordable, or the school is still built on the standard of concrete, that trying to run a wireless connection within that school is impossible. In places like Cleveland and West Phoenix, Arizona, where migrants live, they tell stories of not having the community infrastructure to be able to have people go online through other areas. But there's one thing in all of my travels that stays consistent. They have a local library. They have a computer lab at that library. Remember when I was in Hartford, Connecticut, after walking with these young girls to McDonald's, and there was a meeting at the local library. It was like apples and oranges of the type of access that people were talking about that were deficient within schools, and the lines of people waiting to get on that 7 lab computer station when you walk into that library. They talk about the need to be able to build strong community infrastructure inclusive of libraries to bring access to America. And so by default, all of you are now in this conversation. You have been for years. I've been working with libraries for most of my career. But you're even more linked to the outcomes and the trajectories of life's chances of millions of children and adults and seniors. And let me tell you why you matter. You matter, first and foremost, because anybody should tell you that a library is a better alternative than McDonald's to get your homework done. Let me say that one more time, just in case you fell asleep. A library is a better alternative than McDonald's to get your homework done. That's the first thing. You don't have to buy anything at the library. You just got to show up. Libraries are also the anchor institutions in communities that's often the safe haven for many people that live in those neighborhoods. You play a role. The library does everything except operate a full-fledged credit union, I find, when it comes to resources. You're the main ingredient in developing the community infrastructure whose access to high-speed networks and hardware make it easier for residents to engage. Years ago when I started in this career, so I've been doing this about 25 years, I was a graduate student in Chicago, and I came along when the Community Technology Center movement was starting out. This is about 25 years ago. I know I still look 18. It's just something I'm drinking. I don't know if it's like I got young kids. I told somebody the other day, I think because my youngest is 12 and I got a lot more time, I have to stay young, at least to threaten her every once in a while, you know, keep up with her. But I guess what I say to you all, when I was doing this work, we had no place in community to go except the library. And as a result, when I was trying to build computer labs, we partnered with libraries more than 20 years ago to figure out how we can have this transfer of learning. Because I had no books, I had hardware, but they had all the knowledge. In fact, I'll tell you another story and take you back down memory lane. The greatest resource that I had growing up was an Encyclopedia Britannica. Mom, every year, felt it necessary to upgrade the more than 50 to 75 books for us to be able to do our homework. And you had to have space for those things. It wasn't something that you could just put on the floor. You had to make sure you could see A through C and D through F, etc. Years later, some of you remember, we graduated when technology first came out. This is pre-internet, to that wonderful CD called Encarta. Who remembers Encarta? Lots of libraries got Encarta back in the days. Those were run on 386 machines that had CD-ROMs. So I was a young graduate student in Chicago, building computer labs with young kids who had two things in their community, pretty much: a liquor store and a library, and me, and an Encarta CD. And I essentially would use the Encarta CD to have people understand this is information you could find, but then go to the library and go get the book. Fast forward to the 21st century, I went into my local library, which they recently renovated with my children, and I said, come on, kids, let's go look at the Dewey Decimal System and figure out what book you need. They were like, what are you talking about? You are the community institution. You create the infrastructure for people to get access. In places where people, as I've explained already, have limited access to digital connectivity, the only place that they can go is the library. And libraries have become so much more sophisticated. In New York City, they have a Wi-Fi hotspot lending program. I've personally seen this program, where people can go in and check out a Wi-Fi hotspot device, in addition to a book. And what they're finding in places like New York, Chicago, Portland, they are distributing tens of thousands of those devices to bring internet access back to the home. That interrelationship between the library and the community is one that should never be broken. It is the driver for closing the digital divide. In rural America, the places that I visited, there's the town hall, which oftentimes has a library. But there are anchor institutions that people have come to trust and look to for these types of resources. When I was building computer labs, it didn't make sense to a lot of low-income people until the jobs went online. It didn't make sense to a whole lot of people until they realized that they could only renew their government benefits online. It didn't make sense to a lot of people until young African-American men felt like they had to go in there and expunge their records online. Technology made sense because when we moved from an inline economy to an online economy, people had to get on board. And that's why they came to you. And there has been research over time, and I hear you all in terms of the stress of libraries with the lines of people that are coming to use limited resources, or the librarians who have changed their purposes to not just be the librarian, but also be the technology advisor and the coordinator and the fundraiser. But we got to do better, folks, because without you as an anchor institution, without computers in libraries, we will find ourselves opening that divide for this 13% of Americans that have no place else to go. Let me give you my second point. You all have showed us what it's like to evolve in a disruptive economy. Libraries don't get closed because they don't have technology, or Amazon has kicked them out of the marketplace, or taxis are no longer existing because of Uber. Libraries close because of restricted funding. But what libraries have done, which I think to your credit has been amazing, is that they continue to evolve as the technology evolves. How many of you have seen the digitized collections? Kiosks, collections that are now shared across libraries. Audiobooks that are now available for checkout. Wi-Fi hotspots. Libraries have become the model for how technology can actually coexist in a disruptive economy. That's different than what we're seeing with companies that are closing their doors every day, limiting their workforce simply because they can't keep up. They see themselves being substituted rather than seeing how technology is adding to their experiences. As I say, there's no pop-up library that often exists. It's like in my neighborhood, we have the little box that sits outside where people can donate books. That's still as popular as it was when I was actually growing up, that people pop books in there that their kids have read. Not all of the 16,000 plus American libraries are where we need to be, but let me tell you something. They're far more advanced than where our schools need to be oftentimes, and where our businesses need to be in our communities, and where we need to be as individuals when it comes to accessing technology. And that brings me to my final point before I just offer a couple of policy recommendations. Libraries serve the voiceless. You know, whenever you have a keynote, you got to tell a little bit about yourself. When I was growing up, again, I sound like my grandmother, my grandfather. I feel so old now, right? My grandfather used to say, "Nikki, we walked 10 miles with no shoes to get to school." And now my story is, we didn't have technology when I was growing up. We went outside. It's a whole different framing of the American experience. But when I was growing up, going to the library was so important after school. I grew up in a place called New Rochelle, New York, which is in Westchester County. They built this big library right down in downtown New Rochelle. It's probably the biggest anchor institution outside of the roller rink. Some people know what I'm talking about. It was either a roller rink or a bowling alley, but one of those you were actually going to pretty regularly, right? Every day after school, we'd run over to the library. And we'd run to the library, not just to aggravate the librarians, because she knew when we were all coming, because we would come in packs. It was never like one child. It was always like 10 of you after school that were going to the library. But we would go because it allowed us to actually engage each other and complete our assignments together collaboratively. We'd go because we knew the walk to the library in and of itself was the exercise that we needed to take the stresses off of the day of school. We went because, Miss Ferguson was that safe librarian who would actually welcome us in and shun us when we talked loud, because that's not what you're supposed to do at a library. We went because it was a place, a safe haven. And my mother, who was a teacher, would take us every Saturday, and we'd get to check out 3 to 4 books. And checking out books was an experience when I was growing up, because guess what? We didn't have a computer. As a kid that lived in New Rochelle, New York, the only thing that I could use was the imagination of words on a paper to actually figure out where I wanted to be, to stand here today and have the confidence to speak before people as I do in my career. It was because of the imagination of the written word of books, which is why I'm so excited that I'm writing my own book that will sit in someone's library, as well as on somebody's phone. But most important, it will be printed somewhere, right? At Brookings Press. And if you think about the experience I share with you, and you think about your own experience of running to your local institution, that's not much different than all the kids that we know today. They still come in packs. They still come to check out books. They still come to annoy the librarian. They still come to waste time until maybe mama gets home. They still come. One statistic about libraries that we know, and Pew sort of put it out there, is that a community suffers when a library closes. We know that for a fact. Most people over the age of 16 feel that a library helps them to succeed in life. In many cases, it's their safe haven. I wrote my 500-page dissertation sitting in a local library in Evanston, Illinois, and that wasn't Northwestern's library. It was the local Evanston Public Library. There are people that are affected when that institution closes because the computers that are there, though far and slim, they still provide the ability for you to apply for a job. There are people in America right now that may carry these, but halfway through the month, their data runs out and they can't afford it, so it's just a box. So they've got to go to a local institution like a library to leverage the internet. There are still people, believe it or not, to do private transactions on public computers, like checking medical diagnoses, things that we discourage them to do now in this age of lackluster privacy protections. But where else will they go? There are still homeless mothers and fathers and men and women that sit in libraries to not just waste time, but to often think about what's next. Where are they going to eat? Where are they going to get shelter? I say that to all of you because you matter. You matter in this debate to close the digital divide. You matter in this pursuit of equity. You matter in making sure people have the resources to high-speed networks. But because you matter, people like me, we got to evangelize for you. We got to speak your truth to the policymakers that sit on Capitol Hill that want to cut appropriations. We've got to make sure that state and state legislators and local leaders understand the significance that libraries play in their desire to be smart cities. We've got to get out there and let local people know that annoying the librarian is not the best thing to do because guess what? She's working 2 shifts because the resources were cut. And so I would be remiss as a person who lives and breathes in Washington, D.C. to not share things that I want to take back for you and open up this floor to other concerns and questions that you may have where we can actually get closer to your role in closing this divide. You need more money. Let's just start there. How many people, if you had more money right now, you'd be able to do a lot more things? I might be able to take a trip. Buy my son that car he's going to need in about a year or so. But again, that's my individual consumption of technology that only matters to me. We've got to find ways to bring equitable funding streams to libraries to enhance your technical infrastructure, bring more staff, and stop the hemorrhaging that occurs because libraries are just not built to accommodate the numbers of people that are coming in. And those appropriations happen in Congress, and they happen at the state and local level. And they need to ensure that libraries are equitably funded, much like schools. Now, I'm going to clap for myself on that one. Because if we don't make that argument for libraries the same way that we're making that argument for schools, we're going to see the widening and digital divide of the people that I just talked about. These are real people that exist in America that are offline. Libraries need more public-private sector partnerships. Yeah, it's great when a company can come in and say, hey, we're going to build a program and we're going to offer free internet access to individuals, but guess what? You can find them better in my library than you can on the street. Having those partnerships allows these tech companies that are now using our data as a commodity to bring funding to advance, and perhaps, the day of artificial intelligence will mean that you can walk in a library and you don't even have to touch anything. They will read your mind and say, I'm looking for this book. I'm trying to tell you all that's going to happen. As scary as it is, it's going to happen with artificial intelligence. Libraries need to be on the cutting edge of those public-private sector partnerships. Libraries are not just marginal actors in the digital economy. They are actually the drivers of the supply chain. They're the best testers of new products and services. They are the place where we should be installing new technology in ways that actually advance rather than eliminate and destroy printed media. They already did a number on newspapers. They can't do that with libraries with good public-private sector partnerships. Libraries can actually innovate because you already have. There's no reason a company like Amazon, and I don't know if Amazon is here, but I don't care, wouldn't find ways to actually test products and services within libraries. We are representative of America's democracy, and it's important to have those partnerships. And third, libraries need to always be recognized for the authentic voice that they bring to community. Legislators, and some do, should be going to libraries to hold town halls on these issues that I'm talking about. Right now in Washington, D.C., which is why I decided to do my tour, we do a lot of talking to ourselves. It's actually kind of neat. I only have to take an Uber ride about 5 blocks to talk to somebody who's just like me. But when I push myself 2.5 hours outside of D.C. on a plane ride to another place, I'm actually hearing the voice of America. And the voice of America is telling me, you know what, Nicole? It's not as great as they say. Or that farmer is telling me, I can see the last mile 1 mile away from my farm. Libraries have to continue to be that authentic voice of the people. You see the people. When I was in Hartford, Connecticut, and we went over to the library, like I mentioned, and I was out in the community all day, and they were painting this really horrible story about the lack of internet access, which they don't have a lot of internet access. In my interviews, I would say to people, what's your internet access in America? This is Hartford, okay? We're not talking about like a small town. They would say, oh, my experience with the internet? What do you mean, the Facebook? I was like, honey, that is not the internet. That is only one part of the internet. But when I went into that library, I said to this community activist, I said, why didn't you bring me here sooner? Because the people I thought didn't have access are sitting right here. They're lined up for these resources. They're not going to get a kiosk on a community corner, but they sure will get it at the library. And perhaps the question is, how come we're not seeing more of those libraries in communities where these people live? I did a talk about 15 years ago for the Urban Library Council. At that time, we didn't have all this new technology. It was just basic technology. It was like AOL and static email. It wasn't any of this transactional stuff that we see today. And I remember, as I was writing this, I was recalling that visit. And back then, it was about keeping urban libraries open, right? And today, I think because of the lack of appropriation, it's about keeping all libraries open right now, because certain libraries are under attack. And so I say that to you all. You are the voice for the voiceless. Speak up and let people know the importance of libraries and communities. Say something to the people that sit at those kiosks and ask them to write a letter to a legislator to bring more technology. Have compassion for the person who's waited 2 hours, but hear their story so that you can tell it to people like me and to Jane and to others who can do something about it. Be part of the solution and not the problem of closing the digital divide. We are facing an attack, folks. I sit, drink, sleep, eat digital access in America. And I only do it because, again, having done this for 25 years, sitting in a computer lab as a graduate student in the city of Chicago, watching TSA jobs go online, I can only imagine the strain and stress of what it's like today when you don't have access to this. And the worlds in which we live show us that nobody is speaking for the voiceless. That 13% of America translate to millions of people here in this country and globally billions who are not online. And as we move to the Facebook, to the Twitter, which have all taken on these nouns, I'm like, since when has the Facebook started with a the, right? Those are changing the way that we live, learn, earn, communicate, and even survive amongst some of the conditions in which we're all subjected to daily. Yeah. Sometimes I can't live without the Twitter. But guess what? I'm lucky, I'm fortunate, and I'm still able to have food on my table for my children. So you all play this role And it's an important role going forward. And getting the word out to policymakers that libraries matter in the closing of the digital divide is important. And as you leave here this week, think of these conversations as substantive conversations on how you're going to show democracy just how important local institutions and local gathering places are to our survival. I'm a sociologist. I take it deep. I take it personal, and I keep going. Because I think if we don't get this right, and this is the purpose of my book, shameless plug, Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, we're gonna see the same attacks that we had with the war on poverty in the 60s, because people will go undercounted because they can't access things like the census and their benefits and jobs and education. And all of us know that these are all pathways to success. So keep doing you. And I thank you from my heart for all of the work that each of you are doing. Thank you. I stopped for questions just in case. I was good on time, you know?
Yeah, perfect. I actually was going to ask you about suggestions for us to help, and you talked about the legislature, blah, 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 you know those characters. Anyway, but I like the stories, and I think, you know, we listen to stories, but we don't always tell them enough or document them enough or spread them around enough. And I think, you know, there's some real opportunities there. But I wanted to ask you about ideas in terms of the private and public partnerships, because that's one that's not so easy for us as librarians to work with. Have you got some ideas for us?
I mean, I think there are going to be local opportunities to partner with companies that are within your footprint, right? So if you have a company that is like an internet service provider like a Comcast or Verizon, you'd be surprised by their social responsibility efforts and reaching out as a library to say, hey, I want to bring, you know, let's say Internet Essentials into the library, which is a low-income, low-cost broadband solution for families on reduced-price lunch. You could say, I want to be able to leverage Verizon's portal. Their whole education foundation has a portal that provides educational resources. Those are what I call like soft touch asks, because they need distribution and diffusion channels anyway. Then it gets into what I think are more financial ask and requests, going to foundations, trying to bring, libraries have a history of bringing coding classes and robotics classes. We see all of those programs, but oftentimes when I go into communities, a librarian will say, or a leader will say, well, I brought it because it was something that was nice to do, and my, you know, high school student is teaching it. There are resources for those types of efforts. And then I would say this third piece, and I just testified on Capitol Hill about this. There's this opportunity for businesses to actually engage local community actors on products and development. What is it that you're working on, Amazon, in terms of, you know, distribution or, you know, authorship or workshops that you could actually do in the library? Microsoft, how are you leveraging some of the new technologies that you have that we could actually bring some of that fun stuff on gaming into the library? I'm shocked, and this is something that colleges and universities are actually falling victim to. There are tons of conversations in Washington, D.C. around we can't find talent. The pipeline is too limited. There's not enough engineers. And I find that to be a cop-out, because we do find talent, and get this statistic, but they are primarily found about 2 to 3% of the institutions in America. Harvard, Stanford, MIT, when it comes to engineering. There are schools across the country, historically black colleges, community colleges, that are graduating the same amount of talent. But the difference between those private universities, I'm going to not talk about any scandals, I'm not. I had to catch myself for a minute. I was like, oh, wait a minute, trigger. But the difference between those universities and a community college is often endowments, investments. it's very easy for a company to say, you know what, I want to invest in a local library to start a local leaders program. And that local leaders program will feed into the community college. See, you all are part of, and I hope it came out in my talk, you're part of the integrated community fabric, the local infrastructure that keeps communities functional. What is a community without a library? What is a community without a town hall or a city hall? What is a community without that local grocery store? There are key ingredients of what makes functioning communities. So many of you can go to these companies who are using our data as products anyway, because we are all the product, and say, I'd like to figure out, Google, if there's a way to work with you to optimize search queries at my library. They want to do it anyway. The only difference is you're going to just say, be upfront about it and use me as an example as opposed to just allowing my people to use it without getting the benefits of search. So I would say those are things that I personally have been pushing tech companies on to stop allowing us to be passive consumers or products of the services that you actually build and reach locally to see what your product can actually do. My last visit, this is the last thing, just not to be long-winded, but this is really important. My last visit to Garrett County, Maryland, I went out there to look at a company's deployment of a particular technology. And so on the visit, it turns out that a local company is basically the provider, right, under the larger wholesale agreement. And then the local company took myself as a researcher and a representative of the company. So as we're going through the community and seeing this real cool tech, and again, I'm like, what's your internet access like? The guy from the company goes, wow, I know our stuff was being used like this. And I was like, you need to get out more often and actually see how communities are converting what you're doing into meaningful, worthwhile products. It was just weird, right? It was like, here you are, and this guy is telling you that his wife can now telecommute to Boston via this connection in rural Garrett County, and you're going, I know our stuff could actually do that. And I guess for all of you, push the envelope so that they can, and be proactive about those conversations around the things that you want to try in your local spaces and make them accountable to try it with you.
It's interesting. You mentioned Pew earlier too, and Lee Rainey and his group have done lots around trust. And as you said earlier, that libraries are a trusted piece of that community fabric. And I think sometimes we don't recognize that strength in ourselves and talk to, some of the industry leaders, as you say, within our communities to see what kind of partnerships. So I really appreciate that, and we're pushing each other to do, I think, a little bit more of that.
Yes.
So that's terrific.
I can share. When I was starting tech centers, I was a graduate student trying to make a change because this particular community had broken 386 computers, no Encyclopedia Britannica, and a lot of homework. And I just remember, as a young graduate student who wanted to make a difference, getting on the phone and calling a whole lot of people and asking for help. So my first employee was a Romanian guy who was a fellow for Teach for America. So just imagine, he didn't speak no English, and this was a low-income African-American community, and he showed up because he was free. They came to love him, though, after they locked him in the bathroom a couple of times. He was okay, but he had to go through a hazing process. I was like, these darn kids, I'm sorry, but I needed help, right? There was no internet access going to this building, and we were less than 5 miles outside of the city of Chicago. But at that time, there was something called DSL coming to the Midwest. So I called up this local company that wanted to come to Chicago, and I said, can you run a DSL line through this building so I can give internet access to young kids? And they did. So we had the first DSL connection 4 or 5 miles outside of the city of Chicago. There were no computers in this place. I made my class at the time. I was getting a PhD. I was teaching a class on the social meaning of race, and I said, I got an idea for y'all. Come help me upgrade some RAM and some computers. I wasn't a doctor at the time, but they thought it was kind of cool because they thought there was some kind of sociological impact going to a low-income neighborhood. I said, it will be worth your while. And we literally took out the RAM cards and swapped them out on these broken computers until one day somebody came through from HUD and realized that there was a way to redirect weeded seed money where we were able to buy new computers for all the kids. And I guess I say to all of us who are in this business of doing stuff on our own with limited resources, it never hurts to ask. I'm at Brookings now, and trust me, I ask at every point that I get, because as my mama said, ask not and you will receive not. My daughter annoys the heck out of me. I don't know about many of you with teenage kids. Can I have? When can I have? When are you gonna give me? Somehow I always land up giving it to her, although the other day she kind of tricked me and paid for it herself. I said, hey, I've had progress. But for all of us that do local work where we see the face of that child, or we see that person come in all the time, just ask on their behalf. And I would say, ask a business, ask a legislator. Just ask.
Yeah. We are definitely in agreement there, because that's, one of the things that I have said for years, what's the worst thing that could happen?
No.
Yeah,
no.
exactly. And you ask somebody else.
Yeah, and guess what? They won't know that the other person said no until they loop back together.
Okay, I want all of you to say, after me, I'm going to ask, and fill in your own person or whatever. Okay, so ready? 1, 2, 3. I'm going to ask. All righty. And I want you to repeat that several times today. And I also want you to thank Nicole for her great talk. And we're going to have coffee upstairs.
Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you. Perfect.